At the beginning of 2015, I woke up in my apartment on the north side of Chicago, the morning carrying the familiar smells of stale coffee and dust drifting in from the streets below. Sunlight sliced through the blinds, falling across the hardwood floor worn thin by years of movement, footsteps tracing routines that no longer mattered. On the kitchen table lay a plain manila envelope, its edges crisp, documents neatly stacked inside, divorce papers waiting like a patient executioner. There was no flourish, no emotion, only the cold efficiency of someone who had already decided I was obsolete. I spent the next few hours moving slowly through the apartment, gathering what I could carry in an old, scuffed duffel bag. Tools I had used for work, clothes I wore without thought, and a few photographs of days that felt more like someone else's life than my own. Each item I touched carried weight, not just of memory, but of the sudden irrelevance of all that labor and love. I stacked and sorted, trying to impose order on a life suddenly reduced to fragments. The apartment that had been our home for years now felt like someone else's, a space that had kept its walls and floors, but no longer held our lives. Silence pressed in around me, thick and unyielding, heavier than any physical object. It clung to my chest, squeezing with the intensity of a concrete slab, reminding me with every breath that this was no ordinary morning. The smell of old coffee mingled with the faint tang of detergent from the day before, the refrigerator humming empty and indifferent. Magnets clung to the door, snapshots of vacations and family gatherings that now felt like evidence of a life that had been audited and found irrelevant. Cups chipped at the rims stood as mute witnesses to routine, now stripped of warmth. I realized then that it was not just the marriage that had ended. It was the identity I had built around it, the certainty of who I thought I was and what my life meant. My emotional core felt hollow, as though it had been carefully removed while I slept, leaving only a shell capable of movement but incapable of feeling. Every step I took through the apartment reminded me of absence, of the invisible but tangible weight of what had been erased. Each drawer I emptied, each object I lifted, was a small acknowledgement of loss, and yet, strangely, a faint assertion of survival. I could not stop the unraveling, but I could carry what I needed to carry. The quiet of the space, the emptiness of the rooms, made every sound I produced magnified. The scrape of a chair against the floor, the soft rustle of papers, the click of a zipper closing around my few remaining possessions. My world had contracted into this small set of actions, and I moved through it with a mechanical precision I did not recognize as my own. The apartment, the neighborhood, the city beyond the windows, all of it continued without pause, indifferent to the collapse that had occurred within these walls. I was left with fragments, with nothing more than the barest trace of the life I had thought was permanent, and the knowledge that I had to step into an existence stripped to essentials, uncertain, and unclaimed. A few weeks later, I found myself sifting through the remnants of my mother's life in her old, quiet house, the air heavy with the scent of aged wood and forgotten memories. Every drawer I opened, every shelf I dusted, felt like stepping backward into a life I had only partially understood. It was then, tucked away in a shadowed corner of a closet, that I discovered the small metal box, unassuming, cold, and deliberate in its concealment. The weight of it in my hands seemed heavier than its size suggested, a vessel of secrets I had never been prepared to inherit. Inside the box lay a black card, sleek and unmarked except for my name pressed into its surface, the letters crisp and precise. Beneath it rested a letter from my mother, carefully written, and a set of instructions for a trust she had meticulously structured, a financial apparatus she had shielded from the world and from me in equal measure. As I read, it became clear that this was no ordinary inheritance. The funds had been accumulated over decades, diversified across real estate holdings, stocks, and government bonds, designed for stability and growth, insulated from reckless markets and untimely collapse. Each line of her instructions carried the weight of foresight, of someone who had measured every consequence and calculated every risk. The realization hit me slowly, a pulse that began in my chest and moved outward, filling the empty spaces left by the divorce. This was power, yes, but power encased in vigilance, in rules, in boundaries I had yet to comprehend. It was not liberation. It was responsibility, invisible but relentless. The idea that money could suddenly enter my life with such precision was both intoxicating and terrifying. It was not enough to possess it. I had to navigate it, understand it, respect the architecture my mother had erected while guarding myself against it consuming me. When I went to the bank in downtown Chicago, the enormity of her foresight became vividly clear. The lobby, grand and quiet, smelled of polished marble and controlled air. A space designed to impress and intimidate in equal measure. As I approached the teller, the subtle shift in her expression told me something I could not yet articulate. I had stepped into a world with its own rules, invisible to the uninitiated. Within moments, a senior manager appeared, calm but urgent, guiding me to a private office away from the eyes of other clients. Every movement, every wordless gesture, conveyed that I had crossed a threshold into a realm of scrutiny and control far beyond my imagination. In that enclosed office, I was confronted not with relief, but with the gravity of surveillance and consequence. Every transaction I might make, every decision I could execute, would not go unnoticed. The systems in place would register my actions, trigger alerts, and summon attention where I could not predict it. The magnitude of my mother's planning settled over me like a weight I could neither lift nor ignore. The knowledge that my life was now entwined with invisible networks of observation created an acute tension, a pressure that pressed on my chest with each breath. I understood, with stark clarity, that this inheritance was a tool and a test, a mechanism both empowering and constraining. The question of how to wield it without becoming a pawn in someone else's ambitions gnawed at me relentlessly. Each moment brought with it the challenge of maintaining autonomy, of using the resources she had entrusted to me without sacrificing the essence of myself. The black card was no longer a simple piece of plastic. It was a key to a world that demanded intelligence, restraint, and strategy. Holding it in my hand, I felt both the promise of possibilities and the weight of inescapable vigilance, knowing that every choice I made would ripple through unseen networks and define not only my future, but the integrity of the legacy my mother had so carefully preserved. I moved into a modest apartment on the outskirts of Chicago, the kind of place where every distant siren, every passing car, every late-night footstep seemed amplified in the stillness. The walls were thin, the floors creaked, and the air carried the faint tang of dust and old carpet. But the space gave me the one thing I craved: perspective. From that small vantage point, I could observe the rhythms of the city without being observed in return, my life reduced to patterns, movements, and choices measured in silence. It was a place where I could think, plan, and breathe without interference. Within a week, I acquired a neglected industrial site in the West Loop, a hulking structure of rusted steel beams, broken windows, and cracked concrete, abandoned yet full of potential. The building's decay mirrored the landscape of my own recent life, and its renovation became a channel for purpose. I planned meticulously, mapping out every detail of the project, not to showcase wealth or status, but to create something that would endure quietly. My investments were calculated to maximize benefit for those who would live there, not for profit. Affordable housing units replaced luxury apartments. Communal green spaces replaced unused lots. Sidewalks were lit, paths made safe, and subtle landscaping introduced warmth and structure where chaos had reigned. Every improvement was invisible to the world at large, yet tangible to those who would inhabit the space. Behind the scenes, I fortified the project's legal and financial scaffolding. The trust became a tool of invisibility, an instrument that ensured control without spectacle. Every transfer, every contract, every payment was routed to shield the initiative from interference or scrutiny. I developed layers of protection, mechanisms that rendered any intrusion difficult or even impossible. Yet these measures remained unseen, like a silent current shaping the surface of a river. Control was not a display but a quiet force, shaping outcomes, steering processes, and preventing outside pressures from undermining progress. I walked the site daily, clipboard in hand, boots dusty from concrete and steel. But my focus was not on the mechanics alone. I observed how light fell across walls, how shadows shifted through the broken windows, imagining how the space would feel once alive with activity, sound, and life. I made adjustments not for recognition but for precision, correcting layouts, ensuring paths were safe, adjusting spaces to accommodate the needs of families I had never met. Each decision reinforced the principle that influence need not be loud to be profound. The project became an extension of my own quiet determination, a demonstration that power and intention could coexist without spectacle. I moved through the city like a shadow with purpose, visible only when necessary, yet shaping the environment subtly, systematically, without drawing attention. Every transaction, every permit, every architectural change was a statement of control exercised in silence, a testament to what could be achieved when discretion governed action. I felt a growing sense of equilibrium, a satisfaction deeper than wealth or recognition, knowing that the work would outlast me, and the lives it touched would carry its effects forward. The apartment, the site, and the trust formed a triangle of influence, each reinforcing the other. The city itself became a canvas on which I exercised deliberate restraint and unseen guidance. With every calculated step, I learned how to inhabit power without being consumed by it, how to direct outcomes without drawing notice, and how to shape reality quietly but irrevocably. By the time the initial phase of restoration was complete, I understood that the true measure of control was not in being observed, applauded, or envied, but in the subtle reshaping of the world around me, a quiet influence that would echo in lives and spaces long after my presence became indistinguishable from the everyday rhythm of the city. Months passed, and the quiet rhythm I had cultivated began to shift subtly, like a faint vibration beneath the surface of still water. From the periphery of my life, I sensed movement I could not ignore. Observations of my actions, once invisible and unremarkable, began to carry weight in ways that suggested deliberate attention. I realized my ex-wife and her new partner, a man with influence and resources I had never anticipated, were tracking the outcomes of my work, the flow of the trust, the shifts in the West Loop project. Their interest was not personal. It was strategic, a careful surveillance of opportunity and power. With that awareness came a series of calculated overtures. Invitations framed as reconciliation, as collaboration, as extensions of old familiarity, arrived with an undercurrent that made intentions clear. These gestures were investments, attempts to harness my new influence for their advantage. Every proposal, every request, every carefully worded interaction carried the weight of expectation disguised as civility. It became undeniable that the past, once lived and settled, now cast long, deliberate shadows. These shadows were not of sentiment or nostalgia, but of leverage and assessment, weighing my value as a conduit for advantage rather than as a man in his own right. I responded not with confrontation or anger, but with precision and restraint. Every interaction was measured, each step a boundary drawn firmly in space and time. I refused meetings, declined engagements, and withheld access, not as punishment, but as a demonstration of control over my own trajectory. I reinforced the legal and financial frameworks that had become my shield, ensuring that no intrusion could override the decisions I had already made. Each refusal solidified a perimeter, emotional and physical, around the life I had begun to reconstruct. As I maintained these boundaries, I felt the stark contrast between influence and attachment. Where once emotion had guided decisions, now clarity prevailed. I no longer operated under the sway of memory or longing. Past affections and resentments became irrelevant variables in a system governed by self-preservation and strategic foresight. The recognition that value could be quantified, commodified, and leveraged by others sharpened my understanding of power and freedom. This phase became a test of patience and resolve. I watched the city and the project evolve, aware that the eyes of others followed in silence, yet I continued without altering course. Every adjustment to the West Loop site, every investment, every protective maneuver within the trust was executed without spectacle, a quiet assertion of independence. I understood that the past would attempt to intrude whenever opportunity intersected with history, but I also recognized that control over my own boundaries rendered such intrusions ineffective. In that stillness, I discovered a deeper dimension of self-determination. The shadows of my former life, of old relationships and latent expectations, could linger, but they could no longer dictate my path. My refusal was not rooted in vengeance. It was a safeguard of identity, a commitment to the continuity of the life I had painstakingly begun to assemble. Each decision reinforced a principle. Influence could be exercised quietly, Power could be held without surrender, and the past, no matter how persistent, could be acknowledged without compromise. By the time the first renovations were complete, and families began to occupy the newly restored spaces, I recognized that I had preserved not only the integrity of the project but the integrity of myself, standing separate from history while shaping the future on my own terms. The memory of my mother, her quiet discipline and her meticulous strategies, became the compass for my next steps. I understood that influence without legacy was fleeting, and the accumulation of wealth without direction was hollow. Together with my younger sister, I began shaping a framework that extended beyond property lines and financial ledgers, a foundation designed to create lasting impact. We structured it to assist single mothers, providing training, vocational preparation, and access to resources that could break cycles of limitation and poverty. The operations were deliberate and unobtrusive, devoid of grandiose publicity or the performative gestures that often accompany philanthropy. Yet the outcomes were tangible: new opportunities, transformed households, and a quiet shift in the quality of life within our local communities. Simultaneously, I maintained the development of the West Loop project, but its purpose evolved. Profit remained a consideration, but no longer the measure of achievement. My attention turned to creating spaces where people would feel secure, recognized, and supported, where the design of streets, lighting, and communal areas carried intent beyond aesthetics or efficiency. Every decision was informed by observation, every renovation a reflection of insight into human behavior and the subtle mechanics of well-being. The buildings became vessels of continuity, integrating safety, accessibility, and dignity into their form, and the community began to mirror the structure of care I had envisioned. As the foundation and the development matured, I sensed a rare alignment between action and principle. The trust that had once seemed a burden now served as a lever, a quiet force amplifying intention without intrusion or spectacle. I monitored progress with measured attention, intervening only when necessary, allowing the systems I had established to operate with self-sufficiency and resilience. In these acts of creation, I'd experienced a calm strength, a sense of presence rooted not in domination, but in deliberate stewardship. The work demanded patience and foresight, testing the limits of endurance and adaptability. Yet with each success, each mother who gained skills and confidence, each child who walked safely through a revitalized street, I felt the cumulative effect of deliberate choice and sustained effort. Influence became an extension of integrity, and control a tool of purpose rather than constraint. I realized that the life I had constructed, once fragmented and uncertain, now operated as an ecosystem of impact, where every decision reverberated with intention and every action bore consequence. In the quiet hours, observing the steady hum of neighborhoods taking shape, I understood that creation was not merely the act of building or giving, but the manifestation of values translated into reality, and that this was the true inheritance my mother had prepared me to wield. The reconstruction project reached its conclusion, the apartments filled with families whose lives had quietly shifted, and the foundation began to extend its influence into the local communities. I maintained an exterior of normalcy, moving through the streets of the neighborhood like any other resident, yet internally I was profoundly changed. The shadows of my past no longer dictated my choices, wealth no longer dictated my actions, and recognition was irrelevant. I observed the subtle relief and joy on the faces of those touched by the work, the small transformations in their routines, the renewed sense of safety and opportunity. In these moments, I felt a belonging that surpassed any personal drama, a connection to a continuum of effort and care that extended beyond my individual story. Life settled into a steady rhythm, each day defined by deliberate creation and measured intervention, each decision reinforcing autonomy and purpose. I navigated responsibilities with clarity, balancing the development and the foundation in a quiet equilibrium, ensuring that both continued to operate as instruments of constructive influence. The city moved around me, indifferent yet receptive, and I understood that true impact required patience, observation, and restraint. There was no urgency in seeking accolades, no compulsion to advertise success, only the consistent practice of shaping environments that allowed others to thrive. One evening, I walked down a quiet street within the revitalized district, the light soft against freshly painted facades, the laughter of children echoing from small yards, the careful organization of green spaces and pathways, marking the contours of lives now subtly altered. In that moment, I comprehended that victory was neither wealth nor recognition. Victory was the capacity to build and protect a world of my choosing, to live within it freely, without compulsion or the weight of past entanglements. Every street, every home, every opportunity created was a testament to intention applied over time, and in witnessing the tangible outcome of years of measured effort, I felt the calm certainty of fulfillment. My life, once fragmented by loss and uncertainty, had evolved into a steady continuum of creation and stewardship. And in this new life, I finally understood the power of quiet influence exercised with purpose and integrity.